Hello, Mark. Thanks very much for joining me again on the show.
You're very welcome, Karl. It's staggering. I think it's been 5 years since you and I did the last one. And I was saying off camera, you've clearly engaged much better than I have. So whatever the secret is, please,
Yeah,
please let me know.
and I reinforce the fact it's smoke and mirrors. It's the lighting that I've got in my favour here. So, Mark, we had a great conversation a few years ago, as you said. 5 years, it's hard to believe. And I know all the great work that you've done over the years. You've got a tremendous reputation in the game. But perhaps for people who don't know of you and don't know of your work, if you could just sort of create a little bit of a history of what got you to the point that you're at today.
Yeah, I mean, so thank you again, Karl. So I was the boss for kind of invite me back. And I guess my background, very kind of, this is the very skimmed kind of short version is always had many loves in life, really. Now, some of my loves have been, or an issue, but the love of golf. I was a massive, absolutely like a lot of juniors. I played until they literally threw me off the golf course as a kid, and I always loved kind of anatomy, physiology, that kind of stuff. And I had let's say, a bad shoulder injury when I was younger, but a real irritation in my shoulder. So, despite, for example, I'd see many great physiotherapists. I was always a pretty good athlete in some other areas, so I was very blessed to be kind of okay in some other sports as well. And I was always a little bit, well, if I do all these things which I'm apparently meant to do, um, why is my shoulder still so upset about a few things? So that really allowed me in some ways to combine those great kind of loves, all things anatomy, all things kind of movement, performance, for example. And I think like many people, I mean, you become your own best case study in many ways. So a lot of those early days that we have is consultants, is we're trying to figure out ourselves in a very kind of, very kind of humble, non-ego way. We're just trying to really understand, why do I do this, and how do I resolve this? And so that was really my, I said, the very short kind of skin version of my kind of initial background, my own observations as a player, my own loves, for example, around, anatomy and that kind of stuff. And so yeah, 30 years on now, but I'm very blessed to do what I do with some very cool people. So long may continue. So it's a lot of fun.
What conclusions did you come to with your own situation with your shoulder, Mark, that kind of resolved it in the end?
Mine was really a belief system. I actually think about it now, as you asked me that. Um, it was more conceptual and more like a lot of players, and what they're trying to do in some ways is what creates the issue. So when you're working with players, regardless whether they be myself as a younger kind of adolescent player as I was at the time, recreational players that played occasionally, for example, or even say the most established kind of tournament players, in many cases, it's often what that player is trying to do as far as their kind of belief systems and their concepts, which often creates whatever issues, for example, they're trying to work through. So I had some, as within physiology, our beliefs drive our behaviors. So
Yeah.
physiology is very behavior driven. There's a very defined order in physiology. It goes kind of behaviors, exercise, nutrition, supplementation, and then a form of intervention, whether it be, say, a medication, a device, for example, like orthotics and that kind of stuff. But there's very much behavior driven. But as you know, what drives our behaviors invariably are those beliefs that we have. So when you say movement is a form of behavior, which is what it is, it's a very expressive form of behavior. I had some very, I wouldn't say defined beliefs as a younger player, but I received feedback from someone which I really thought was this guy's the absolute. So there was um, I say that most people, often the information they're given, it's less important is the person who gives the information.
Yeah. Yeah.
So sometimes, the person giving the information is actually more valuable than the information being provided some days. And that was my experience. My perception of this person was, if they say it, then it must be true.
Mm.
So therefore, it's just part of my personality. I would do it every day, all day, because I really was aspirational to playing. In the kind of fallout was what I was trying to do just didn't help. Within movement, they call conflicts. There's a lot of conflict around, say, for example, what I was trying to do, and then how it connected, say, more anatomically with how I was moving. And that then caused some issues around my shoulders. So, and that's where, again, you go back and very much the defense, as it would be in this case, is say the physios, they would give me wonderful feedback. But as long as I continued moving that way and had the beliefs that I had, yeah, it would, the issue would just reappear. So no amount of training or rehab, for example. So if you're doing as you know, 3, 4, 10 hours a day of golf versus 30 minutes of rehab. That's a huge imbalance. So
Yeah.
that one was going to beat this one. So mine was partly belief based, partly perception of who gave me the information I thought was that they said it and it's true.
Yeah.
And in the fallout was then a shoulder issue.
Mm. And through your career, Mark, and spending a lot of time with players of all levels, but a lot of good players that you've worked with over the years, what have you observed, say, in the last 10 years or so, have been some of the sort of myths, if you like, or dark not dark tunnels, blind tunnels that people tend to go down, that now you're able to dispel some of those myths?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful word there, and I think that, as you know, invariably old myths are replaced by new myths, and that's typically what happens with players. That this year's thing replaces last year's thing, and that, yeah, I guess it's just that is an observation. Say in the last 5 years since we spoke, that's a very common observation of players that this year has its thing.
Right.
So if you go back, say, 3 or 4 years ago, everybody was trying to do a certain movement. Then a new device comes along, and then this is about these values on this device. And then the following year, there's now this guy wins the event, so therefore this must be the way you do things. And even players at that level are still somewhat seduced in some ways by these kind of approaches that if someone starts to do nicely, and this is the thing, always, it doesn't surprise as much now, but it certainly used to many years ago, was the real lack of context that players apply to their own development. They don't have a lot of guys, the ability to press pause, just kind of zoom out a fraction, and then really start to look at context. It's going to look at why you're doing this. And I kind of say that to then, ironically, a mutual friend of ours said, you and I were speaking off camera there. I was just saying to him before you and I spoke, you kind of look at it in 3 ways. I mean, the information really allows us to establish what you do, but then it's very much down to the kind of know-how that the end user, for example, then really to help to understand why you do it. And then once we've got to know why you do what you do, then it's having, what resources can be used then to kind of best resolve X, for example. And even those players can't still will be somewhat seduced by kind of this year's thing, or whoever won the last event. Therefore, that must be the approach that they use. And they again, this has been somewhat unkind to many, because many guys are wonderful. Many of the players have wonderful approaches to what they do. But that real lack of kind of intellectual context. Sometimes I say this with great luck, they have kind of intellectual failure, many of these players. And so it really goes back on it. A lot of discussions I have with players is really around that. Let's kind of understand why you do what you do. And, why do you believe X to be true, for example? So you start exploring the beliefs that they have. And so a lot of what I will do with players is understanding, for example, why they believe X to be true. If you think about our beliefs drive our behaviors, and also a big one within movement is the emotion at that moment in time drives the player's attention. So whatever emotional placed at that point in time where drive their attention onto certain things. I'll give you an example of that. You'll get some players some days that produce just say certain values. Let's just say launch monitor, to give a somewhat kind of coarse example. It's fine. It's all good. There really is no kind of stress to that. But the following day, they're just in a slightly different place. They could be, say, dehydrated. They could slept poorly. They could be in emotion in a very different place. Those values now were suddenly problematic. I kind of say, well, the values haven't changed in the last 24 hours, somewhat has. So often what you find with these players is emotionally in a different place.
Yeah.
They've had an argument with their other half, for example, or their beliefs have now been slightly kind of somewhat disrupted for whatever reason. So they now see the same values that helped them win yesterday to be problematic today. So I spend a lot of time with guys around. It's just, I say to most players, don't look at playing the grass, look at the whole lawn. Just kind of zoom out, press pause, and just breathe on this. And then the nervous system likes the out breath, Karl, in some ways. It likes to be down regulated. That kind of, just breathe out and pause and look at, just figure out why you do this. And I had a discussion with a player this morning. And I remember saying so well to him that, very few movement problems are ever movement problems. Everything will display as a movement issue around what we do within high performance e-golf, but the actual driver, the real mechanism, as they're called inside, which is driving that apparent movement issue, is very rarely ever a movement issue.
Really?
There's something in life, there's a disruption somewhere within that lovely kind of ecosystem that we live within that then displays in the way they move. And but more players now, thankfully, to kind of bookend your question in some ways, are now becoming more aware of this. When they start having certain ball flights, when they start producing certain movements or certain values, or they start experiencing pain, the movement itself isn't always the issue. It's the fallout from
Right.
these bigger life events that often happen in advance of, for example, the session, for example, today.
Mm. So what you're saying there, Mark, it's interesting. I was with a player the other day, and we were talking about reacting to shots, and he'd had problems reacting to shots, and inevitably going into why did I do that, and then going into sort of search mode of what's happening in the mechanics and all the rest of it. And I said, how would it be if you move forward and instead of reacting to shots, you actually look for patterns and an individual shot. If you ask the question, what did I do wrong on that? You can disappear down a rabbit hole, can't you? Whereas if you look for patterns within a round of golf, if there's a distinct pattern there at the end of the round of golf, you can then work with somebody like yourself or a coach or whatever. But I think the shift in perspective from shots to patterns can be really beneficial then.
Yeah, I mean, do you give real, how that my daughter's 6, so when she has, 6-year-olds have those kind of moments, bless them, it is a Perry just under smart, okay, it's just that within 2 minutes onto something different, and then all of a sudden, what problem 2 minutes ago? And that can still be some players sometimes. So you learn by these guys to take there's a tremendous difference when you look at how players move, Karl, between perception and perspective.
Right.
I'm always trying to shift them into, let's just look at it with perspective now. So players typically would talk about the media. They give this dramatic headline, and underneath it give you the real story, the context of the story. But most people look at the headlines only. So an example might be, how do you play? Oh, terrible. Well, let's just take a breath and just kind of walk me through then the round, for example. Like 3 under through 9, then eagle 10, birdie. Okay, so, 18 under, terrible shot on 18. Okay, so you played great. It was just one bad shot today.
Yeah.
So players are very good at using perception to often share feedback rather than it's a little bit of perspective. If you look at it over the last day, week, whatever period of time you wish to use, that then often tells a very, very different story. And that kind of reminds me of to give an example on that, which is what I love actually. Typically, players respond to 2 things: feed or flight within how we move. Where's the ball gone? How they show? That's the kind of typical mechanisms players will use to share feedback. The ball did X and it felt like this, for example. It was interesting, kind of during the COVID phase, after you and I spoke last time, where many people, if they were lucky, had nets in their gardens and played off mats. So you kind of remove and change then those 2 main sensory feedback systems that we had. You remove the flight, and the feel was very different from mats to grass. And it was remarkable how many guys came out of lockdown back in 2020, 21, but it was now. All of a sudden, they're playing terribly because they removed those 2 main feedback systems of movement. Where did it go? How did it feel? Because the mats, I do a lot of this with players. You actually measure or capture them. Say, for example, on grass and mats, and the difference is disturbing.
Really?
How different so move, especially the more established players, will move so differently, for example, on the grass compared to mats. So I had another discussion with the player this morning around, they're doing some practice in the US in the net, for example. I said, well, really true learning is when it's reconnected with nature. So to truly define learning is, can you perform that way within nature, within the environment of whatever task it is you're trying to operate within. And so I think that's, it's always a fun one to discuss. When you start playing around with kind of ball flights in fields, for example, from a movement observation, probably one of the most disruptive influences we can use is to remove the ball flight and then get playing off a different surface. Players will normally perform very differently.
Yeah. So what would your sort of guidance be, Mark, or your suggestions? It's the time of year when people are perhaps thinking about a winter program and what they're going to do, working on the game for next year, the keen players. If somebody was to embark on some swing changes, what advice would you give them, and what sort of red flags would you give in terms of trying to make those changes and make them kind of more fundamental movement patterns?
I think it's a lovely word you used there. So typically players, I look at it, do you want to make a swing change, a swing improvement, or look to improve performance? Because they're very
Yeah.
so a lot of what I would do is around how do we improve the performance of how you move, rather than say change how. Not I can change player X and make them a lot worse. I'm sure I've done that to many players, unfortunately, but we all have, and I'm being in a fun way. So a lot of it is very much defined by, again, the framework, and kind of how you kind of label it in some way. So let's look at how we can improve the performance of how you move, rather than say let's change how you move, which is historically how many people would see this. And again, I came back from the UX yesterday. I got back yesterday afternoon. It was 23 degrees, beautiful. In England today, it's not. And so you just have to take you take your view. It is what it is. What can you do? So you kind of do just look at what you can do, rather than kind of get stressed about what you can do with players. So I think a lot of it comes back to just being very precise around what is it exactly you're trying to achieve in that, whatever, within the net, for example, the time, whatever, again, the context of that session might be. So I think for most people now, as you and I record this, as we kind of move into the real winter here in England, it's just been very, very defined. Okay, let's kind of look at what we can do. And don't get stressed about what we can do. That's just the reality of, golf in England in November. And let's just be very defined. If we are going to look to, say, improve the performance of how you move, how can we start to explore this? What approaches can we use to kind of start to play with this? And also what markers, what systems, again, can you then start to use to then start to track then and establish those performance markers that we look at. So I'm very defined with players that way. So you can argue in some ways that when you define, you also confine, which is a challenge within the word define. If I define something, that creates a confinement with what they do. You're not confined to that kind of definition. But I'm always throwing around that at players that, what is the exact question you're looking to explore, in what the best ways that we can look to explore this. And I think when you just start to kind of frame it differently, it really is so organic in some ways that how the emergence and these kind of different movement systems start to happen, rather than let's look to change how you swing. Yeah, which is a whole different way of approaching it, perhaps not the most kind of helpful one.
So when you talk about the performance of movement, is that then relating it to specifically trying to improve ball flights, the actual output of the swing?
Again, it comes back to a question. So I'll give an example of a young guy I saw whilst I was in the US. Plays on the PGA Tour, just had a stress fracture of his spine, which is not pleasant. So we had a very precise question to explore. Let's start to look at how you're moving and what the contribution is, for example, to that kind of stress fracture experience in your spine. So, okay, that's a nice definition in some ways. Everything we're exploring now and playing with is connected back to how does it influence how the spine moves, the loads it's been exposed to, the ranges it's got to move through, for example. So there's a very clear, very precise approach. Okay, our question is X. So to get good at that, we've got to get good at this stuff over here. So less whatever relates to that and why we go near it. So I'm very into that with players. You kind of keep them somewhat on the task. And unless whatever it is relates to the question we're trying to explore. So in this particular player's case, a stress fracture, which is not fun. And let's just start to slow down again and start to just figure out an issue. Okay, we know what you do now. Let's start to establish why you do this. He's actually went back to even shoe design. There was even some issues with the design of shoes his player was using, which was then causes some constraints in how the feet move. Because of the disruption to the feet, the spine had to adapt in such a way that the adaptation, unfortunately, created that kind of issues through his spine. So again, that's another example that a movement issue was actually not a movement issue, it was a shoe design issue.
Right.
Start looking at his footwear design, then the feet could do what mum and dad made the feet to do many years ago. The spine could then start to do what it needed to do, all doing well now. He's in a very, very cool place. So again, without being somewhat not dismissive in some ways, it always comes back to that, Carl, creating context, having the framework, and then, what is the question? And I say this to most players in most sessions, really, how can I help today? That's always my first question. We have this information. How would you like to use it? Another big one, again, all the guys to look at is, if I came to you moving this way, Carl, how would you help me? So, yeah, what I'm always trying to do initially is, as early as you can in the session, it's for them to start to understand what they need to do to solve the issue, not be dependent on a third party, for example, like myself. So it's a big one that I have in my own framework that I try and work within. How early can I get the player in the session to start to understand what I need to do to solve this, rather than what the mark give me to solve this? So in some ways, you start to get them to immediately start to see it. Well, what do I need to do now, rather than be dependent on, for example, say, and that's unfortunately where, for many, many, many reasons, you and I would need to do an encyclopedia of these podcasts to start to understand, why people are so automated these days. But it's that's a big one that some of the more established guys will try and do. They try and put it on you as early as you can. And in the most playful way, you just start to get them within those early phases of the session. Okay, so what do I need to do to solve this now? So they start to understand and start to think then more independently, rather than be, say, dependent on, again, often these kind of third-party people to help them resolve this.
So you're helping the player increase their own awareness of their movements, and then they can start to solve the puzzle a little bit more themselves.
Well, that is golf, as Carl. Golf is awareness training, awareness of thought, awareness of nutrition, awareness of movement, awareness of behaviors, awareness of sleep, awareness of the environment. It's awareness training, golf. So all you ever try and do is increase the awareness that player has around these various areas.
One thing I wanted to touch on, which leads on from awareness, when you become aware of, let's say, inefficient patterns, inefficient shots that you're playing, what's your? I mean, there's been so a lot of research on internal focus, external focus. What's your kind of latest understanding on that? Do you have preferences, or again, is it very much an individual thing? You have certain people in academia who are very dogmatic about trying to improve movement, should be externally focused. Where do you stand on all of that?
Well, I think, again, that's where we just did the pause and just kind of zoom out again somewhat. And people like to polarize. We live in this very kind of demonized, polarized world. What side are you on? And I say it a lot. It even goes back to, say, either kind of nature versus nurture. The issue there is the word versus. That's a very demonized reference. Nature versus nurture. No. It's nature alongside nurture.
Nature and nurture.
Yeah, but it's nature alongside then what you've been exposed to and how you chose to experience it. And that is how play developed. Mum and Dad gave Karl these great capabilities, but it's then what were you exposed to as a younger player, for example, and how did you choose to see those experiences then? Often then will move you in whatever direction you moved in. So it's nature alongside nurture. And that's another example of internal versus. We have very demonized. Yeah. Well, it's both. I mean, I've yet to see any player that of any real credibility, or any real established player, the needle's doing this in the session, moving between those two frequently. Often, you can have a really good example of physiology would answer this question nicely. And again, it really kind of somewhat course these threads into your world, that how you feel on the inside would influence how you see the environment. But how you see the environment affects how you feel on the inside. Then you cannot separate physiology from the environment. So if I'm hungry, I'm a little jet lagged today because I went to the States for a day yesterday. I was actually there 20 hours. It was my whole trip from leaving home to the US. It was a very short trip. So I'm a little bit somewhat tired today. And so how I'm feeling on the inside would very much influence then how I see the outside world today. And vice versa, when you start to see things in such a way, and influences, then you get these emotional responses, frustration, disappointment, for example, sadness, anger, these emotions that we have. So the idea of nature, again, it's internal feedback alongside external feedback. It's both. I might hit a shot with an external piece of feedback, but it creates an internal response. And that felt great, but that's an internal response. Or I hit that shot, I'm not sure about it. It's that. I get to see any player miss a putt to win a major championship and give an external response to the miss. Normally starts, I just felt terrible, I feel so bad, and I'm so disappointed, whatever, internal bits of feedback. So when you look at academia, I mean, you got to look at it always though, who's the research for, who's paying for it, is, where does it sit within? So ultimately look at some of the research, it's for someone, by someone, to often reinforce the values these people have.
Yes.
Very few researchers critique their own work and then say, well, maybe I need to look at this a bit differently. So I think we got within golf, it's both. And as you know, there's times where some players may just at that point in time, again, based on their emotional arousal levels, if they're slightly a little flat, for example, they need that somewhat kind of motivation. Or some players in the opposite, you need to kind of just slow down because you're almost, slightly tongue tied in some ways. Players will move between engines, they're not always. And that's why, I mean, it kind of goes back to one of the original questions that you and I discussed today, around kind of swing changes. Another word I spend time with players around is the idea of balance. I need to, look at and make sure I'm balancing how I move. When you look at that, this is kind of somewhat, you could say, semantics, but it's slightly esoteric in some ways. It's much more about movement harmony than movement balance. But you look at, say, music's my great love. I mean, you could have, something loud on the drums, big kind of lead guitar, and a very kind of very soft bass note. That's not a balance, but it produces wonderful harmony within the album.
Yeah.
So the great movers they do little bits of this, more of this, and that creates harmony in the move. If you get the same amount of both, that would create a stress. So I kind of describe movement that way. The basis of movement in some ways, Karl, is the idea of become more, become less. How do we need less of this? And how do we do more of that? So it's like kind of how you tune a radio, for those who remember. Kind of radio tuning now, it's just turn these ones down a fraction, these ones up a bit. Now we've got harmony in the movement. Because you kind of say to people, and this is big ones, I think, hopefully, that kind of some of your listeners might kind of look at, and it kind of goes back to physiology again. That our physiology is very well defined. We have two choices in life. You either change your behaviors or change your expectations. And that's the way physiology works. You either change the way you behave, whether it be, again, how I see, again, hydration, sleep, whatever it might be, again, or you must start to expect something different.
Right.
You only have 4 choices within performance. Stop doing something, start doing something, do something more, do something less. That's the 4 choices we have. So I kind of immediately put that on plays as early as I can. These are our 4 choices today, wherever. We need to stop doing this. We need to start doing this. We need to do less of this one or more of that one to create that lovely harmony within how you perform.
And that's a lovely way of putting it. Is to explore that harmony, isn't it? Rather than demonizing one thing or another. Another thing I wanted to touch on with you, Matt, that intrigues me is, there's been an awful lot of talk in the last, and I know we're talking in general terms here, which we shouldn't do, but there's no option on a podcast. There's an awful lot of talk about the body in golf, what the body should be doing, and all the rest of it. But then when you look at the kind of real estate in the brain, or the territory in the brain that's relative to the hands, that the hands take up an enormous amount of space in the brain in terms of skill development. From your expertise, just go into that in a little bit more detail about how important it is to perhaps keep open to that.
Well, you're on my favorite subject now, Karl. So you and I could talk for a long time on it.
All right.
It's in a southern place. They aren't the hands part of the body. I mean, they are the body.
Yeah.
I mean, again, that's another, not you. This is how people like to demonize it. The arms. Oh, sorry, Karl. Said on our computer. Apologies to the listeners for that. My phone is on, but we came onto my Mac. The hands are part of the body. As I might say, what is it, brain or body? Well, the brain is the body. I mean, it's a big discussion in movement. Are we a brain that lives in a body or vice versa? That lovely interaction. So we look at, say, as you mentioned, the real estate of the brain, over half the brain is allocated to movement and vision. So our brain devolution often, history often tells the story if you look close enough. So over half the brain is allocated to vision and movement. So we are very visual movers. Over 80% of our sensory feedback is visual based, unless there's an unfortunate an eye disruption. And often then how we respond within movement is often 80 milliseconds after the brain is visually then perceived, whatever it may well be. So vision and movement are very, very inherently connected, which is why our brain is over half the really set connected to that. How that threads into the hand question is that you look at what the basis of movement in life is. Again, this is kind of human evolution since day one. This isn't Mark Ball or something new. This is how we've evolved as human movers since really the kind of, the early days of mankind. It's how the hand is that the body communicates via the hands. The brain and body communicate via the hands. Movement is then based on how the hands and eyes coordinate the best position in the pelvis. So there's these lovely kind of threads to what we do. So it's going to slow down the ghost now once again. Over half the brain is allocated to vision and movement. The brain also the brain communicates, say for example, through the brain and body communicate via the hands. Sorry, excuse me. That's kind of jet lag talk in there. And the basis of movement is how the hands and eyes coordinate to best position our pelvis.
Right.
And that is typically, again, allowing for, very precise movements. Almost every movement we make in life would be that kind of how the hands and eyes coordinate to best move my pelvis. An example being, I have a cup over on my table. I'd look at it, I'd reach to get it, and I would follow, and then pick up that cup. So I looked at it, hand-eye coordination. I then start to move my pelvis and reach for the cup. So I actually got in trouble a while ago. And again, I think people kind of lost again the context behind. I was asked the question actually on another podcast. I kind of crudely said, well, it really should be called hand reaction force, not ground reaction force.
Right.
Because within our nervous system, the feet follow the hands. Again, if I reached to pick up that cup, my feet would follow and produce a force on the floor based on my intention, which is I'm thirsty. That's a physiological response again. I need to reach, then I need to reach to pick it up. I produce the force on the floor. So I said, loosely speaking, the feet are really responding to that lovely interaction between how the hands coordinate the best position of the pelvis. So rather than calling it ground reaction force, I said in a fun way, we should maybe call it hand reaction force. But unfortunately, some people kind of lost the kind of context of that and got somewhat offended by it, which is unfortunate. But anyway, so you look at, say, even the foot-based movement, the feet follow the hands. There's a reason why we don't learn to walk until quite late in our development as a young infant, because within the hierarchy and movement is somewhat kind of lower down. And you look at young babies are always picking up things and touching and tasting it, developing that sensory awareness. I mean, we have such a large proportion of nerve endings in our lips and our fingers, as we do in our feet as well. But that lovely touch, taste, pick up, vision, hand-eye development, the walking side of development, happens often, say, for example, 12 months old from birth for a reason, because it's quite low down on the hierarchy. So you're absolutely right there that the hands are the body, like the brain is the body. That's a lovely discussion within the movement world. We are a brain within a body and vice versa, or are we a body within a brain? People like to demonize it's all about the hands and arms. Well, they are the body.
Yeah.
I'm not aware that these are not part of my body. Vision and movement is over half the brain. The brain and body communicate via the hands. There's a ton of research around. Look at, say, how we evolved to speak. We actually used to communicate via hand signals way back when. Then we learned to sing. Then we actually learned to speak after we learned to sing. So you see, my brother's wife is Italian. She's very expressive and
sensitive.
Yeah, very expressive, because there's such a neurological connection between words and speaking, in this case, and hand movement. So that's a lovely example there that how my brain and body are communicating via, say, hand signals. So it's a massive one, so tremendous one.
And would you say there's then scope to explore developing skills in the hands, or developing feel in the hands as a means to improvement?
Massive. I think it's, again, allowing for individual questions and, again, very precise approaches. And you kind of need that within golf. I say to most people that whenever there's a precise question, it needs a precise approach. We generic approaches on kind of precise questions. It's unusual at some point within that discussion where we don't discuss what the hands do. And or you get people that are very movement aware, Karl, and so aware around what they do. We may start exploring, say, lower limb, the neck, whatever it might be within, say, their movement system, but they feed it back via, say, what the hand and club now does.
Yeah.
So intuitively, they start to make those connections. So we might discuss, say, for example, how the feet move or kind of how the spine is moving. And that's kind of given us our framework or context. But what it meant then to move that way was I now perceive, my awareness is my perception, I now move a different through the hand. So that's it. So although it may not be the dominant area, for example, the very localized area you and I discussed, say, for example, in this session, it's very unusual that players, regardless of their perceived status, don't then feed back a reference around my awareness is now the hand, the club are now doing X.
I mean, there's a great,
although it might be it might not be an explicit intention to do it. Invariably, people will share feedback around it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great video. We shouldn't again singular people, but it's a great video of Tiger in the early 2000s when he was dominating the game so much, and he talked an awful lot about perhaps not being able to see the flight of the ball, but I remember him sort of gesticulating. He said, "I just feel the shots in my hands. I feel it in the fingers." So it was clear he was he was struggling to verbalize exactly, I think, what he meant, but it was clear that the hands for him were extremely important in his sense of creating golf shots.
You can expand on that. I mean, you can kind of look at that in two ways. It's certainly, again, more advanced, more accomplished players. For all the advancements, again, like we said at the start, this year's thing was what? That's just kind of people like this year's thing. And still the single biggest influence on how we move and why we move the way we do is clubface awareness.
Yes.
So I could change lower limb, the pelvis, some of the larger segments. Does it always migrate into the club face? Not always. For some it will, but others less so. But when you start influencing the awareness of the club face, almost always every other segment will adapt. So again, you could start again. I'm going to start to kind of just
Matt, sorry to stop you on that, because that is such an important. I think that's such a massive, massive point that you've made there, that I think everybody needs to sort of write that down, because have we not fallen into the trap with a lot of instruction where we're jumping in at what the body's doing, but actually the genesis of that is a reaction to what the golf club is doing and the club face is doing.
And people look at it, what is it exactly we're trying to do? We're trying to move a club through space that produces a certain impact and then achieve a certain ball flight. So golf was even, I think, taught the wrong way around. We learn to hold before we understand the environment. And what are they actually trying to do with the ball? Say, an example being the 10th of Augusta. Okay, so what are we trying to do? The ball for, say, a right-handed player needs to move, or for any player actually, right to left down the hill. Okay, so to produce that ball flight, the club needs to kind of move what way? Okay, for the club to move that way, how could we then move in downswing? Could be in the word rather than should. So to move that way downswing, how could we move through backswing? Okay, so to move that way through backswing, how could you hold it stand at address? That's how we kind of learn to move, but invariably a lot of players do the other way around. Let's get you to hold the club first, independent of, again, nature. What is it we're actually trying to do with the ball flight? You're going back to that Tiger one, which I love, by the way. This was mapped by an Italian, disappointed forgotten their name, so I do apologize to an Italian anatomist years ago, mapped how that every single muscle within the human body connects into the fingers. So they're called myofunctional connections in the body. So every muscle in our body. So when we move our fingers, we have corresponding movements through the foot, the spine, the hip, the shoulder. So every other muscle in our feet, for example, in our pelvis, all these kind of segments actually connect into the fingers. And that's why you'll often hear these lovely old phrases in life that you look at, say, science, and all science does these days to confirm what we knew 50 years ago was true. And that really is the role of science. It confirms it. It's mad that I think we need science, Karl, to tell us that nature's good for us. That's a whole different discussion. But these old phrases, it's in the fingers. I can feel it. Yes, because every tissue connects into a digit. And when you start to kind of move fingers in these ways, as people can watch this recording, for example, as I start to move my fingers this way, That's coupled with, say, pronation of the forearm or extension of the spine or kind of supination through the foot. So, mm, which is why still, it's how we get club face awareness is through our hands again, hands and fingers. It's why, as you say, neurologically, there's so much real estate within the brain allocated to finger movement and um, and kind of hand movement, and um, and it's still how we get our feedback because it's where we perceive the cup will be. It's based on the orientation in the position of the hands and fingers. So you kind of get asked these questions sometimes. What's the one thing you can do? Again, we have a very reductions view of the world, unfortunately, at the moment. We heavily filter most things. But typically, if you start to improve most people's kind of hand club face awareness, very few guys will regress.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah. And from what you're saying though, Matt, with that, as the club face awareness perhaps through the hands increases, and as a result of that ball flight improves, potentially movement that supports those things actually starts to improve as well.
absolutely right. So again, I was kind of, you don't want to kind of isolate any variable. Just say force plate, for example. When I use force plate, so I can start to change the profiles through the draw. Doesn't always then migrate into club face.
Yes.
But if I start to change the club face, almost always influences the force values.
Yes.
So in a hierarchical system, yeah, changing what the feet do for some, not always, for some can influence, say, the club face. But when you start influencing hand and club face, almost always it influences the feet.
Yes. Yeah. So would you say then, Matt, that, and I'm probably answering my question here, but I'm thinking about, we talked about stuff from 50 years ago. I'm reminded of, great players in the past, like Henry Cotton was famous for getting his players to hit car tires and things like that to increase the hand strength and awareness of the club face and things like that. It seems from this conversation that Cotton in the 1930s and 40s, neurologically, biologically, was in the right ballpark, really.
Yeah, I wouldn't advise guys to hit tires.
And no,
Like
I'm not saying doing that, but actually being aware of the hands and tuning into the hands.
massively. I mean, yeah, romantically, yeah, absolutely, yes. I mean, the concept of hitting the tire is probably not
Not
the most
ideal.
vital piece of feedback for, say, kind of wrist and neck health. But again, so again, this is where science, again, it really, you look at it, I kind of give examples sometimes in presentations that I used. John Daly in the 80s intuitively knew to hit the ball a long way, swing about long and fast. So now did a research paper to tell us, hit the ball a long way, swing about long and fast. Well, Daly knew this in the 80s. And Lee Trevino knew the value of what's called the 3D flat spot. So he kind of figured out back in the 60s and 70s that to be so reliable and somewhat predictable through impact, we need a longer, what's called often called an impact interval, the 3D flat spot. We now need devices to tell us that to be reliable and predictable, we need longer flat spots. Gary used to wear different size shoes. He knew the value of the ground forces. We now need a force plate to tell us value of force plate. So all science is doing is confirming what these guys knew with John Daly's I started playing golf in 87, so my generation, somewhat. Daly figured this out 35 years ago, but we now need science to tell us that what Daly knew way back when is now good. So these players intuitively and somewhat intellectually kind of figured things out. Okay, to do this, I need to do what? Again, rather than be dependent on. There's a lovely phrase in a wonderful book called The Elusive Obvious by Moshe Feldenkrais. And the person who wrote the foreword to that is a guy called Norman Deutsch. He uses a wonderful phrase. He goes, would you eat someone else's pre-digested food? And that often is what learning is. They take the mineral density, the nutrient wealth, you get left with the waste. And that is often like coaching. They give you their experiences and their needing all these exposures. You have to then essentially, that's like eating someone else's pre-digested food. It may have meant that to you. It doesn't mean it's going to mean that to me. Yeah. So I think we got to start to kind of shift back more that way again. Again, how would you solve this, player A? If I came to you moving that way, how would you help me? Based on what we discussed now, what's your understanding of X? So I think a lot of it, as far as, again, how, again, in a very humble way, how I try to frame sessions is you're very much allowing the player to start to explore, what does it mean to me to move this way? What's my understanding of, rather than Mark said what, which is a whole different approach to perhaps explore and learning.
Yeah, because then if the student starts to be able to solve the problems in the training environment, they can then begin to solve the problems in the playing environment, can't they?
Yeah. But if it goes wrong on the first tee of an event, you can't phone whoever up. I mean, it's time you to solve this now.
Mm.
And that's often a big separation you get between they can often get this a lot, I'm here to practice today. Well, rather than practice, what about learning? They're very different. Rather than what would you like to practice today, what would you like to learn today? So I always start a session with that. What would you like to learn today rather than practice? You don't know what practice means. You need to reinforce what you currently know or do. But learning is a very different approach. So what would you like to learn today, Karl, for example?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'd really like to learn about, okay, great. Let's go to that lovely phase of exploration and to start to help you learn this. So
because learning then leads to development of skill, doesn't it? And ultimately, we're trying to develop a series of skills to solve a bunch of problems on a golf course.
You're right. So I hope my daughter doesn't go to school and practice as a 6-year-old. I hope she goes to school to learn.
Yeah.
And but we moved away from that. It's called the practice range, but it should be called the learning environment or the exploration environment for us. That's how we've evolved. But we're going to a phase of devolution these days, unfortunately, rather than evolution. We are devolving as a species for many, many reasons. So we're trying to kind of shift the needle back this way to get guys to explore again and play. And what does it mean to me not eat, again, pre-digested food?
So one last question on that then, Matt. What would you, and again, we're generalizing, but what would you see a sort of learning session look like for the, for the average golfer listening to this, who's maybe struggled this season with the game? What would you suggest would be more of a learning environment as opposed to a practice environment that they could explore themselves?
I think that much more kind of playful based approach. Again, you kind of look at even some of the words you've used today. Let's explore how we can improve the performance of how you move, or again, what would you like to learn in the time you have today? You've only got maybe you might have 20 minutes. To give you an example, my brother, he lives in Dubai with my brother, very busy guy. He probably gets an hour a week, which is his time. So to have these great training programs, no chance, absolutely no chance we do this. You have an hour, which he can get away from things and just do his thing. Okay, so how can we use that hour? How can we best use your 1 hour a week? How do we really start to really max out the time you have with the aspirations you have and in the areas you're looking to improve in that 1 hour? So that kind of free could force in some ways. So I could give him 2, 3, 4 things to play with. He ain't going to do it because of the constraints of time that he lives within. So you're very aware of that, okay, with the time you have and the aspirations and the resources, how can we best kind of start to kind of design this for you now to kind of allow you to learn and explore? And so then really your role is then, again, if you put it back to say just, recreational players again, that much more kind of playful, reflective, I say to most guys, if you just replace should with could, you'll have a very different experience. And show me the ways you could do this. How many ways are there doing this particular movement? Yeah. Rather than this is what you need to do. Well, needs a very powerful word within our nervous system. You need to do this. Well, need and want are somewhat different.
Yeah.
But how could you do this?
Yeah.
How many different ways can you fade it as an example? Well, there's many ways of achieving that. They start to explore them. So you're trying to get them to reconnect themselves again. We've got so disconnected with ourselves for many reasons. We're just trying to kind of reconnect again with the inner child in some ways. Yeah. There's a lovely phrase in the movement. It says, never leave the playground. And I'm trying to get everyone back from the playground again.
Yeah.
And
I mean, could is an opportunity, isn't it? Should suggest a threat, doesn't it? You've got to pass or fail on every one.
Yeah, you should do this. Well, says who really? And for every kind of guy, I've had the pleasure of working with won a major championship. When you start saying the word should, you can always see him do this. And they kind of pull back.
Yeah.
And you say could, it then comes towards you.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Mark, it's been 5 years, but in that time, a lot's happened. But one thing stayed consistent: your information is fabulous, and it's very thought provoking. Thanks ever so much for sharing your great expertise with everybody tonight. Where can people find out about all the things that you do?
Well, thank you, Karl, first of all. I've loved the discussion with you, and hopefully we'll do it again in less than 5 years' time again. It was an absolute pleasure. So thank you so much. And apologies for my somewhat slightly kind of jet-lagged head to that. So I've been to the US and back in pretty much one day.
Yeah, well, you've done well.
So our daughter's confused. How did you have breakfast? Go to the US and come and have breakfast the following day. So you're a little bit confused by that. And but yes, either I do a little bit online sometimes. So on the kind of social media, kind of Ball 3D Academy, or my website is just ball3d.net. So, but happy to help in any way, tell anybody. I'm always very grateful for these opportunities. So more than happy to help.
Great. All right. Thanks ever so much.
My pleasure, Karl. Thanks again.